So I would like to welcome all attendants to the third online lecture in 2021 of the lecture series of the BIH Translation Hub Digital Medicine. This lecture series features discussions with leading international experts in fields such as digital health, health data sciences, health data privacy, and data sharing. And I will be moderating today's lecture. My name is Fabian Prasser. I'm a BIH professor of medical informatics and also a member of the steering committee of the Translation Hub Digital Medicine. So I would like to start by doing a little bit of housekeeping. As you can also see on the slide for the audience, please turn off your camera and your microphone at all times. We are very happy if you ask questions. If you want to do so, you can post them to the chat towards a user called Organizer. And in the end, we will have a Q&A session where I will read the questions. The lecture will also be recorded and made available on the internet. So please make sure, as I mentioned, to turn your camera and microphone off all the time or leave the meeting if you do not want to be recorded. If you want to Twitter about the event, we would of course be very happy. Then please refer to our Twitter handle @BerlinNovation. So it's now my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Khaled El Emam. Khaled has a PhD from the Department of Electrical and Electronics Engineering at the King's College at the University of London, and he is currently the Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Medical AI at the University of Ottawa, where he's a professor in the School of Epidemiology and Public Health. Khaled is also a senior scientist at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario Research Institute and director of the multi-disciplinary Electronic Health Information Laboratory. Khaled conducts research on privacy-enhancing technologies to enable the sharing of health data for secondary purposes, amongst many things, including synthetic data generation and de-identification methods. He has also co-authored quite a few books in this area, and amongst them, one of the best books that are available on these topics. So he's also a very active entrepreneur. Khaled has funded or co-funded 6 product and services companies involved with data management and data analytics, and some of them also had successful exits. Khaled has also co-funded multiple companies in the privacy-enhancing technology space for medical data, and amongst them was Privacy Analytics. That's a company that focused on data anonymization and de-identification software that was later acquired by IQVIA. And with that said, the title of his talk, as you can already see, is Practical Mechanisms for Generating Anonymous Data. And now I would like to hand over to you, Khaled. The stage is yours.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I appreciate your invitation today for me to present to you. So the plan for the next 35-40 minutes or so is I will give you an overview of risk management, how to create non-identifiable data, some of the techniques, not all of the techniques, but some of the techniques that we have used that are being applied in practice and that have worked well in practice. And then I'll shift gears and focus more on synthetic data generation, because as I will argue, I see that as being the future of data sharing, at least a big part of the future of data sharing. So let's get started. First of all, just a disclosure. At this point, I run a company called Replica Analytics, and we build synthetic data generation software, and the company is a spin-off from the university. A lot of our research ends up being implemented in software that Replica Analytics develops. So let me start with some just very basic definitions to make sure that we're all on the same page and we have the same baseline when we start talking about identifiability and re-identification risk. So imagine that we have a data set, a simple data set here that we want to share, and the data set has 3 variables: the sex, the year of birth, and a drug code. And one of the privacy risks that we would want to manage is identity disclosure. Now, this is not the only privacy risk that we would want to manage. There are other types of privacy risks, but I will focus mainly on identity disclosure for the purposes of our presentation today. What identity disclosure means is that you assign an identity to a record. So in this example, we have a female who was born in 1989, and once we identify the real person, let's call her Sally, who is that female born in 1989, and we attach an identity to the record, then that's essentially identity disclosure. So when we share data sets for secondary purposes, for analytics and for research, for building AI and machine learning models and so on, we want to make the probability of correctly assigning an identity to a record to be very small. You can reduce that probability through generalization. So in this particular example, we generalized the year of birth to a decade of birth. And now we have two females who were born in the same decade of birth. So that is an example of generalization of the year of birth, and that reduces the identifiability of Sally because now it's harder, there's more ambiguity as to which record belongs to Sally in this particular data set. Now we have two records with a female who was born within the same age range, and so there's additional ambiguity with respect to the identity disclosure related to those females born between 80 and 89. So generalization is one example of a technique that can be used to reduce re-identification risk. There are other techniques that can be used. You can suppress records by removing a value. You can add noise to the data. There are other techniques such as microaggregation, which replace a value with the average of adjacent records. So a number of different techniques that can be used. The most common ones that are used in practice are typically generalization and suppression, but of course there are others, as I mentioned. When you are worried about re-identification attacks, you have to consider re-identification attacks from two different directions, because depending on how you evaluate re-identification risk, the risk is different depending on the direction of attack. So in practice, we always consider two directions of attack. One direction is a population to sample attack, where an adversary, this is the attacker, knows someone in the real world and wants to match that person or what they know about that person to records in the data set. So in this example, we are trying to match Sally, who we know in the real world, with the database. And then in this case, we have two matches, or two potential matches. And then the other direction is you have a record in the data set, and you try to match it with people in the real world. So this is called a sample to population attack. And in this case, that record can be matched to two different people. So again, there's some ambiguity in the sense that as to which record which person that record belongs to, given that all we know about them is the sex and year of birth. All that to say is you have to consider both directions of attack when you are evaluating identifiability, because depending on the risk metrics you use, the risk will be different depending on the direction of attack. And just a little bit more background, when we were measuring re-identification risk, we were worried about quasi-identifiers. So in this example, I'm going to assume that sex and year of birth are our two quasi-identifiers, and we measure risk in terms of group sizes. So in this particular case, again, we go back to the year of birth. We have one female born in 1989 in this data set, and therefore the group size is 1, and the risk is measured as 1 divided by the group size, which in this case means 1. So this is unique in the sense that the female born in 1989 is unique in the data set, which gives you the highest possible risk, and that uniqueness is one measure of risk. Is the extent of the number of records or proportion of records, for example, in the data set that are unique. And when you apply generalizations to the data set, your group sizes increase. So in this case, when we apply the generalization of decade of birth, now we have two records with female born in 1980 and 1989, and therefore the risk for that record is 0.5. So here we have reduced the risk through generalization. I'm oversimplifying a number of different things, but I just wanted to make sure that I'm conveying the basic concepts so that when I talk about a few other things later on, we're all on the same page. So generalization reduces the risk, and the risk is measured by group sizes, and as we increase the group sizes, the risk goes down. But of course, it's not that easy because most data sets are samples from populations. And therefore, in practice, we also worry about the group sizes in the population. So the examples so far, I've assumed that our data set represents everybody in the population. So, the data set has 10 records, and so the population that we're interested in is 10 people. But in practice, a data set is a sample, and therefore we have to worry about the group sizes in the population. So for example, how many females born in between 1980 and 1989 exist in the population? There are 2 in our data set, but there are 10 in the population. So measuring the risk has to take into account the population group size. And since we don't know the population, like we can't, we don't have a population registry with all the data, we have to estimate the group sizes in the population. So statistical disclosure control, and a lot of the work in the statistical disclosure control community has focused on estimating these group sizes in the population. And there are many estimators with different levels of accuracy, etc. If you don't do that, if you don't consider the population group sizes and only consider the group sizes in your data set, then your risk values will always be very conservative, will be quite high. So as we saw here, if you look at the risk in the data, it's 0.5, but if you look at the risk in the population, it's 0.1. And population risk is the correct one because when you look at different attacks, it always ends up being based on or driven in a non-trivial way by the population group sizes as well. So these are the basic concepts around identifiability and measuring re-identification risk, and some of the basic techniques for reducing the risk in data sets. So let's say we can measure the risk in a data set, and we've have good estimators, and we've measured risk in both directions, etc. Now, how do we know that the risk is acceptable? So typically, we have we define identifiability as being on a spectrum, with a probability of 1 being that the data set is identifiable, and a probability of 0 meaning a data set is not identifiable. And 0 risk is not achievable, of course. It's not a realistic standard to set because all data sets will have some risk of re-identification. But we measure the risk and along the spectrum, and then we define a threshold that cuts this spectrum into 2, because most legislation, most statutes are defined in a binary fashion where you have personal information and not personal information, or identifiable information and non-identifiable information. And therefore, if your measured risk is above the threshold, then it's considered personal information, and if it's below the threshold, then it's considered not personal information. There are a lot of precedents for what this threshold should be. Precedents from privacy regulators, from health regulators. European Medicines Agency has recommended a threshold of for the anonymization of clinical trial documents, clinical reports, and clinical study reports that are shared through their Policy 70 Transparency Initiative. So that's a pretty strong precedent. Health Canada has used the same threshold. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid in the US has used the same threshold. So there are some thresholds that are commonly used in practice. So we have quite strong precedents for what's deemed acceptable. There are court cases, there are regulator orders from privacy regulators. So there's a pretty good body of precedents that we can rely on to select a threshold that is defensible. So we can measure the risk, we can have a threshold, and by doing so, and we have techniques for generalizing or suppressing or modifying the risk in the data, and therefore we can apply all of those, measure the risk, and keep applying transformations to the data until the risk moves below the threshold. So that's the basic principle or set of principles around creating non-identifiable data. But of course, there's always a trade-off between utility and privacy. So the more you transform the data, the less useful the data set is, because you're removing detail, you're removing granularity, you're removing information from the data. And therefore, it's really a trade-off or a balancing act between utility and privacy, in the sense that you don't want to transform the data too much to protect privacy, but then lose utility along the way. So this is what differentiates algorithms for creating non-identifiable data sets. Some algorithms provide optimal solutions or globally optimal solutions that try to find the globally optimal balance between utility and privacy. Some algorithms use heuristics, which may not find the global optimal, but achieve some other acceptable balance, and it'll give you a different balance between privacy and utility, and so on. But the basic principle is you don't want to transform the data too much because you lose utility. If the data has no utility, after you make it non-identifiable, after you cross the threshold, nobody will use it. It's not useful anymore. Researchers will not use it, companies will not use it, and therefore we're really wasting our time. So we really have to think about utility at the same time to make sure that we are creating useful data. But that's not all the story. So historically, one of the more common or I think applicable and used methods for creating non-identifiable data is risk-based approach, or risk-based anonymization, or risk-based de-identification. The terminology varies, but the basic principle is that you apply the data transformations, as we have already discussed, and you also implement controls. So the data transformations are generalization, suppression, noise addition, microaggregation, and various other techniques that can be applied. And these reduce the risk of re-identification up to a certain point. And then any residual risk is managed through controls that are put in place at the data processor or at the data recipient, such as security controls, privacy controls. And you can also have contractual controls that allow you to impose conditions on the processing of that data. So the overall risk then between the data transformations and the controls is below the threshold. So you don't achieve risk below the threshold by transformations only. The transformations take you part of the way along the spectrum, and then the controls bring you across the threshold to make the data low risk. And the reason for that is utility, really, because as data sets have become more complex, including many variables and many domains that are being integrated together, and as the ability to attack data sets has improved over time, the number of transformations that are required has increased if you want to rely on transformations only. Therefore, you apply transformations a little bit and then controls a little bit. So this model has worked very well until it didn't. And what's starting to happen is, as data complexity has started to increase, organizations started to rely, well, they did two things really. They started to rely on controls more and more. So they would apply few data transformations and a lot of controls. The problem there is few data transformations means that the organizations are taking shortcuts, in the sense that there may be many variables in the data set that need to be transformed to reduce the risk, many variables that can potentially be attacked, but they only focus on a subset of the variables because they don't want to transform all the quasi-identifiers, all the potentially attackable variables, and therefore they only transform a small number of quasi-identifiers and then apply a lot of controls. The problem there is you're only transforming a small number of quasi-identifiers, and that you're ignoring still a good chunk of quasi-identifiers, and then you're relying extensively on controls. The problem with that is it becomes very expensive. The economics become less attractive because you are applying a lot of security and a lot of privacy controls to manage the risk, and you're essentially spending as much money processing the non-identifiable data as you were identifiable data, as the extent of controls keeps growing. So the economics become less attractive. The whole point of creating anonymous data or non-identifiable data was that the level of controls and the security levels and the privacy levels would be reduced, and you can process that data with minimal constraints. But if you need to have all of these controls in place, then the economics become more challenging. So that was one of the trends that we started to see. And the other trend was regulators became less convinced by the model because it relied so much on controls in practice. in theory, it was great, but in practice, when you see few transformations and a lot of reliance on controls, then the regulators became skeptical that these controls were being implemented all the time and continuously being in place and always traveled with the data. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm just stating what we observed in practice was starting to happen. And then the other challenge, of course, was that there were more and more examples of re-identification attacks. We've criticized those re-identification attacks. I think that many of them overstate what has been achieved. But I think at this point that doesn't matter anymore. The narrative around re-identification attacks has been established, and it's negative in the sense that it's possible the narrative is it's possible to re-identify data sets, and therefore the confidence in existing techniques has been waning over the last few years. And here's some examples of headlines that we have seen in the media around this. And again, I'm not going to get into whether these attacks are what they say they are and what their weaknesses were and whether the results were overinterpreted or not. I think we're past that point. That's an interesting discussion, but we've reached the point where there's a general sense that these attacks are real. So that has resulted in again, a negative narrative that feeds this skepticism by regulators and to some extent civil society and the public. So we need something else. We need to move our techniques for creating non-identifiable data to something else that is better, that addresses some of these criticisms, and that can continue to provide reasonable protection in practice. So this is why we moved to synthetic data generation. And I'll talk a little bit now about synthetic data generation as another approach for creating non-identifiable data. So synthetic data generation starts with some real data. So you take a real data set and then you build a model that captures the patterns and the statistical properties of that data set. And this model is almost always a machine learning model of some sort. Whether it uses statistical machine learning or deep learning methods, but you build a model that tries to capture the patterns in the data set. And then you use the model to generate new data, and that's the synthetic data. And because there's no one-to-one mapping between the records in the synthetic data and the source data, then the argument is the privacy risks are diminished. It's not real data, and you can't map synthetic records to real records. We'll talk about that later on. You have seen synthetic data before. These examples on the right-hand side here are examples of images, synthetic images of people. These are not real people. These are people generated from generative models that have been trained on images of real people, and then it generates images of fake people that look quite realistic in practice. So the methods have been improving quite a bit over time, and our focus really is, at least for today's talk, is on structured data, which is the example on the bottom right-hand side here. It's an example of a data set from a clinical trial. So the synthetic data that's generated looks very real. It maintains the same structure as the original data and the same statistical properties and relationships and patterns as much as possible in the synthetic data as in the real data. So a few questions that come up is, how good is, how large can the data set be when you create synthetic data sets? So we started doing this on clinical trial data sets, which happen to be small. And so that drove a lot of our early research and early work in this space, and that we developed techniques that are suitable for small data sets, but that can also scale to larger data sets. And then another important question is, do you need to know the analysis that will be done with the synthetic data set in advance to build these models, to fit these generative models? And the general answer is no. You don't need to know the analytics, the workloads in advance. Of course, if you do, you can take advantage of that information. But as a general answer, you don't need to know the eventual workloads. These models will capture enough of the patterns in the data that they should be able to accommodate many different types of workloads. The other interesting thing about data sharing and data access with synthetic data is you don't actually have to share the data. You can share the generative models themselves. And what we found is organizations are more open to sharing generative models than they are to sharing data sets, because we share models all the time. We share models when we publish papers, for example. We include the parameters for the models, the formula for the models, and so on, the standard errors, the fits, etc., as well as descriptive statistics on the data sets themselves. So we've been publishing models and characteristics of models for many years. Here we're making available more complex models, but the concept's still similar in the sense that we make available models, and then data consumers go to the models, executable models, and generate new data sets from these models, and they can create an arbitrary number of records from these models to meet their analytic needs. So if you need to augment or amplify data sets, you can generate a large number of observations from these models, and they'd all be synthetic. So this conceptually, this works very well, and we've had some great successes with this over the last couple of years. But we can always come back to same set of questions, and I'll try to address some of the basic questions, and then we'll switch to privacy and utility afterwards. So when you are creating synthetic data, there are really two big use cases for using synthetic data. One is replication, and one is inferences. What replication is that you create a synthetic data set to be able to replicate an analysis that was done on a real data set. So for example, if you publish a paper and you want to make your data set available in a privacy preserving manner so that other researchers or citizen scientists or someone can replicate your analysis results reasonably well using the synthetic data. So that's a perfect example of a replication use case. The data set is going to be shared to enable replication of an analysis that was done on that, published on that data set. Other examples of replication are when you are using data sets to train people, for running demonstrations of software, for software testing. These are all replication examples, and really your objective is to perform analysis on the synthetic data to replicate the results that you would get had you obtained the real data. Inferences is a little bit different. Inferences is you get a synthetic data set, and you're not trying to replicate the analysis that was done on the real data. You're trying to do a different type of analysis and draw population inferences, or inferences about population parameters. And so the analysis you have to do here is quite different. You're not driven by a previous, or your point of reference is not a previous analysis. You want to do a new analysis, and you want to draw inferences about the population. And this is where concepts from imputation or multiple imputation become relevant around how to do a proper analysis on synthetic data if you want to draw population inferences from that synthetic data, because data synthesis is stochastic, and when you are building models with synthetic data and you want to draw conclusions about the population, you have to account for the uncertainty introduced due to this synthesis stochasticity. So there's a bunch of approaches, techniques you have to use if your objective is inferences. And the way you evaluate synthetic data if your objective is inferences is also different. And then the other thing, which I think is really important, we've been doing quite a bit of work on, again, how do you evaluate the quality of synthetic data? So I'll give you a general model. You have a generator, which is a machine learning technique, can be statistical or deep learning, that takes as input real data, creates a synthetic data set, and then at the end you evaluate it through some kind of discriminator, which compares the real and synthetic data sets, and then you feed the results back to the generator to tune the hyperparameters for that generator. There are variants of this approach. You can, if you're using GANs, for example, type of deep learning architecture, you would use random data here instead of real data, but the principle is the same. You have a generator, generates synthetic data, and a discriminator that is used to tell the difference between real and synthetic data, and the discriminator score is then used for training. The problem is that we found that a lot of, well, okay, in theory, the results of this discriminator, the evaluation results, should be predictive of how good your synthetic data is. So if your objective is replication, then the discriminator scores should be predictive of how well your synthetic data analysis replicates real data analysis, right? Because you're optimizing on that score, and therefore you want to make sure that you're optimizing on a good score that's meaningful in practice. And if your objective is inferences, then you want your discriminator score to be predictive of how accurate those population inferences are going to be when you are doing analysis or building models with the synthetic data. So we've been doing an analysis of different utility metrics, and what we're starting to find is that a lot of the utility metrics that are used are not predictive. They're not predictive of either one of those or both of them, at least in the way that they're currently being used. So I think there's an interesting research agenda here around defining meaningful utility metrics for training these generative models. So that's an ongoing line of work, but it's an important criterion is at least it has to be predictive of how the synthetic data will be used afterwards. Okay, so now let's switch to evaluating privacy and utility. So I'll give you some examples and some models that have been used for that. So you can apply the identity disclosure model also to synthetic data. And the general perception has been that because synthetic records are not real records, you can't map them to real people. But in practice, you can sometimes, because sometimes generative models overfit, and therefore you're able to map synthetic records to real people. So if you imagine you have a population, whatever that may be, and then you have a sample of people from that population, and then you create a synthetic version of that sample. We'll assume the synthetic data set is the same size as the real data set. And let's imagine that there's a male who's 50 years old in the synthetic sample, and there's another male who's 50 years old in the real sample. So we do have a match between the synthetic data and the real data. So, and these matches will happen, and they'll happen more frequently depending on the nature of your data set and the extent of overfitting in your generative model. But that's not necessarily a problem, because as we saw before, you can always evaluate the risk in your real sample relative to your population. So if your real sample, that 50-year-old male had a risk of 1, then that's a problem, because now you have a synthetic record that matches a real sample record that has a risk of 1, because it's unique in the population. If that real sample record has a risk of 0.0001, then that match doesn't matter, because you've matched a synthetic record to a real record in the real sample, but that real sample record has a very low risk of re-identification anyway. So this brings us back full circle to what we discussed at the beginning of the presentation, in that to evaluate the identity disclosure risks of synthetic data, you have to be able to measure the risk in the real sample in the traditional disclosure control manner that we discussed earlier on, because a match between a synthetic record and a real sample record is good or bad depending on the risk of the real sample record. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, even after you match a record and evaluate the risk on the real sample, the next question is, do you learn anything new from that match? So let's say you match and the risk is high. Do you learn something new? Because your synthetic data is distorted, all the records are distorted. So if I share my synthetic data, and I have a male who's 50 years old in my data set, and I know that that male is unique in the population, do I learn anything new about that person from the synthetic data, because all my synthetic data has been distorted as well? So it's a two-part test. One is, what's the probability of matching a synthetic record with a real person? And if you match a synthetic record with a real person, do you learn something new? And we've built a privacy model to evaluate that. And of course, the overlay on top of it is you have to look at the risk in both directions, population matching to a synthetic sample and a synthetic sample matching to the population, as we discussed earlier on, because the risks will be different depending on the direction. So that's the basic, essentially an attribute disclosure, conditional identity disclosure model. It's one privacy model for evaluating synthetic data. Another privacy model for evaluating synthetic data is membership disclosure. And this is the commonly used method. I think that there's additional improvements that can be made here, but the basic idea is that you take your data set, you split it. So part of it is used to create a synthetic data set, a synthetic version, and part of it is a holdout. And then you measure the distance between your synthetic data and your full data set, your training and your holdout, and see whether the distance between your synthetic data and the data set that an adversary would potentially have allows you to predict which records are in the training data set. And that way, you're able to estimate whether an adversary can determine if a person was used to train a generative model. So this is membership disclosure and the number of techniques for evaluating it. So these are the two privacy models that have been used for synthetic data: this attribute disclosure, conditional identity disclosure approach, and the membership disclosure approach. So I'll just show you some case studies and examples of some work we've done recently to kind of put some meat around the concepts that we have been talking about. So for example, this is a study we did where we created synthetic data sets and we evaluated the privacy of them using the attribute disclosure dependent conditional identity disclosure model. And we evaluated the probability of a correct match where you would learn something new about the person as well. Two data sets, the Washington State Hospital Discharge Database and the Canadian COVID-19 database, case database, at the time that the paper was published, which was towards the end of last year. And as you can see here, these are the measured values for the fully synthetic data sets. And we used the 0.09 threshold. As I mentioned, this is the European Medicines Agency, Health Canada, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid thresholds, commonly used one. But I mean, the probabilities from the synthetic data are much lower than that. And this is the probability without adding any controls, right? So this is, I think, one of the advantages based on the data we're seeing is that synthetic data tends to have quite a low risk without controls. And here we're synthesizing the whole data set without, we're not removing any quasi-identifiers from the analysis. We're considering all the quasi-identifiers, and we're still getting quite low probabilities compared to the threshold without control. So the results are quite encouraging from that perspective. And then in terms of utility metrics, I mean, there's some basic ways to evaluate utility metrics. I'll give you some examples. One way is to compare the distance between the marginal distributions of the real and synthetic data sets using a Hellinger distance, which is one way to compare these distributions. The nice thing about Hellinger is that it varies between 0 and 1, so it's easy to interpret. And so you do that for all your variables and you plot it on a box and whisker plot. So the example on the left-hand side shows you, like a 3% median distance between real and synthetic distributions. And then you can do external, we call them external and internal validations, which essentially means you build a model with your synthetic data prediction model, in this case, classifiers, and you build a classifier on your real data, and you compute the accuracy, the area, and under the receiver operating characteristic curve, in this case, the AUROC, and you evaluate the difference between the real synthetic data and the real data and the synthetic data models accuracy and plot it on a box and whisker plot. So in this case, since we don't know how the data will be used, we don't know what the real workloads are, we build all the models. So all models test. So we take all the variables and build models for all the variables. And then we compute the AUROC absolute difference and plot that. And as you can see, the differences in this example are also quite small between the real and synthetic data models. So this basically tells you that if you build models with real data versus synthetic data, you will get comparable results, which is encouraging. And you can test it by having a holdout sample or from the real data, or a holdout sample from the synthetic data. That's the difference between internal and external. So let me walk you through some actual, this is the replication use case that I showed you earlier on. Show you some actual results from case studies, and I'll walk through those quickly, and then we'll close off with future-looking scenarios. So this is an example of from a clinical trial data set where the object, it's a colon cancer, stage 3 colon cancer clinical trial, and the objective was to look at whether bowel obstruction is related to disease-free survival. This is a Cox regression model. As we can see that the results, the parameter estimates, and the 95% confidence interval for obstruction, which was really the main objective, so adjusted estimate of the impact of obstruction are very close to each other from confidence interval perspective, high overlap, plus the parameter estimates as well. But in general, we get similar answers between the real and synthetic data sets for all the parameters, but really the focus in this analysis was obstruction, which is right here. So this is encouraging, given that it's a somewhat complex data set, and we're able to get some pretty close results between the real and synthetic data sets for the replication use case that we mentioned earlier. This is another example where we looked at the COVID-19 mortality in Ontario. So we built models to predict mortality, and we evaluated the area under the curve for building prediction models with the real data and the synthetic data. This is because mortality is quite uncommon. It's a highly imbalanced data set, and the prediction accuracy was quite high, using two metrics: the receiver operating characteristics and the precision recall curve as well. So the results were quite encouraging from both in that the results on the synthetic data are very similar to the results on the real data set. And for that, we used gradient boosted decision trees, and the variable importance, in this case, we found that age was the most important variable, and then date of infection or date of test confirmation of COVID-19 was the second most important variable. Again, the results are very consistent between real and synthetic data. Mortality prediction over time. So this is dates since 1st of January 2020. We can see here the first wave in Ontario finished collecting data at the end of November, so the second wave was just about to start. Again, strong concordance in the predicted mortality, a probability of death between real and synthetic data for quite a complex, or at least a nonlinear functional form. And this is a conditional partial dependency plot, which factors out the other variables in the model and focuses on the impact of in this case, date reported on mortality with the 95% confidence intervals. And again, here, age and mean probability of death, again, for the COVID data, very strong concordance between the real and synthetic data sets. So if we release the synthetic versions of these data sets, we draw pretty much the same conclusions as we would with the real data sets. We see the same patterns and quite high confidence interval overlaps with a 95% confidence interval as well. So these are all examples of using synthetic data as a kind of a modern or contemporary means of sharing information. The results on privacy and utility have been quite encouraging thus far for increasingly complex data sets. And the evidence is accumulating, and the evidence is generally pointing in the same direction. But privacy is not the only use case for synthetic data generation. We've been focused on privacy so far. Another very interesting application is creating virtual patients. So in this example, in the context of clinical trials, we are using, well, let me step back a little bit. Currently, more and more organizations are doing single-arm trials where they only have a treatment group, and then they use real-world data to create an external control group and use that external control group, match it with the treatment arm that they collected data on to essentially simulate a trial and then draw conclusions from that. The challenge is sometimes it's difficult to get real-world data. The quality of real-world data is often not as high as the quality you'd expect in a clinical trial. And therefore, instead of having external controls, you can have internal controls where you collect partial data from some patients in the control arm and then build a generative model from that and simulate the remaining patients in the study. So we've been doing some evaluations of this concept, and the results have been quite good in the sense that we're able to obtain similar results with the synthetic controls or virtual patients. Let me call virtual patients because the term synthetic controls is overloaded. With the virtual controls that allow us to get the same results as if we had collected data on the real patients. So this is a very interesting application of generative models in the context of digital twins or creating virtual patients to support augmenting patients in clinical trials or any kind of clinical study for that matter. And then, of course, the other interesting application is these generative models are quite powerful, and then you can run simulations or use them as prognostic models with multiple outputs. So typically when we build prognostic models, we have a model with a single variable output, but with generative models, you can have 10, 100, 200 outputs, 100 variables at the output, so you can run pretty complex simulations. And these output variables or the relationships among these output variables are maintained as well, so you can do complex simulations that capture the correlations and the dependencies among the output variables as well. So this also is a very interesting potential application of generative models, and there's some early work in this as well. So lots to do with generative models and synthetic data, but from the perspective of privacy, as I said, there are challenges with existing models and methods for the reasons I described. SDG is a promising new approach. We're getting good results with it. Adoption has been growing over the last couple of years, but beyond solving the privacy problem, synthetic data and generative models can solve additional problems as well beyond privacy for supporting and doing better and cheaper and faster clinical trials by solving or partially solving the recruitment problem or the attrition problem, depending on how you look at it. And then also, of course, for building powerful prognostic models that can be used to provide recommendations at the point of care. So exciting directions for that as well. So I'll stop here and see if folks have questions. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Dr. El Emam, for this really excellent talk. We have quite a list of interesting questions that we can ask. Maybe I can start with a question, and that would be regarding the legal point of view, right? You focus quite a lot on technical aspects of synthesization and anonymization. Could you elaborate a little bit on how this relates to legal requirements? There are differences, for example, in the US, for example, the HIPAA law and the GDPR in Europe. Do you see any sort of specifics in regards to data synthesization, for example, as compared to traditional anonymization when it comes to legal compliance?
Well, if you look at it from the lens of risk measurement, being a measure on this identifiability spectrum, and if you can demonstrate convincingly with reasonable assumptions and reasonable conditions that the risk is below the threshold, then it's considered non-identifiable information. I think the main difference that we're seeing here is that the claim that the risk is lower is much stronger with synthetic data, because you don't have to rely as much on controls, and that just the data risks are smaller as well. So the existing framework to some extent is relevant. Some scholars or legal scholars have argued, well, it's not real data, and therefore you can't regulate it in the same way because it's generated from a model, it's not derived from real data, it's derived from a model. So that's certainly an argument that can be pursued. With respect to in the US, what we have started to see is IRBs, like research ethics boards, waiving the requirement to review research protocols that are based on synthetic data, because they don't see it as data derived from human subjects, which is a very interesting development. So this is, there are some examples. It's not taken over, but we're starting to see some examples, which is interesting. And then another interesting just data point in Europe is that CNIL has, which is the French Data Protection Authority and regulator, has recently approved a data synthesis methodology as an acceptable anonymization technique. They haven't done that. They had the authority to do that for many years, but they haven't done that for any other methodology, but they just did it at the end of last year for a data synthesis methodology. And CNIL's tended to be quite a strict regulator with respect to anonymity and definition of anonymity. So that's an interesting data point as well, in that they saw that synthetic data generation has sufficiently low risk that they would approve it as an anonymization methodology. So we're seeing positive signs from regulators in general, different types of regulators, ethics as well as privacy. My conversations with regulators also, we're seeing a lot of interest in the topic, and my hypothesis here is, as evidence accumulates, it'll become easier for more regulators to see synthetic data as an acceptable way for data sharing.
Thanks. So there are more and more questions rolling in. The next question would be, Dr. El Emam, in data anonymization is particularly challenging for data sets that come from a healthcare context, right? They're often longitudinal, they're quite of high dimensionality, there might be a lot of quality problems. Could you comment on how well the synthesization approach works in your opinion or in your experience for such longitudinal data sets, and also, for example, for data sets that do have a lot of missing values? What is your experience in this regard?
We've achieved some pretty good results on the synthesis of longitudinal data, quite complex longitudinal data, and we have a number of articles that are under review now in this space. So hopefully we'll see some results coming out. There has been some work already on synthesis of longitudinal data, but I would argue that you know, the complexity of data has been increasing. Or in the past, folks looked at one longitudinal sequence. You know, you look only at diagnosis codes over time, for example. But now we're starting to see models that combine multiple longitudinal sequences, so drugs, labs, discharge, claims, etc., together for patients over time and over extended period of time. So the models are getting better at the synthesis of longitudinal data, and I expect that to continue. So I don't see that as a challenge. And here we're really talking about deep learning models that are being applied to do this. It's in terms of missingness, that's not a problem. Missingness can be modeled, and the synthetic data can be generated to have the same patterns of missingness as the original data, and there are techniques for doing that. So I don't think that's an issue at all, except when missingness is very, very high. When you have, you know, 95% missingness or 98% missingness, then that's more challenging. But in general, missingness can be modeled and can be included in your synthetic data when it's generated as well. Other quality problems, depending on what they are, there's been a lot of work on pre and post processing data sets for synthetic data generation that allows different levels of messiness to be accommodated. But I won't say all quality issues can be modeled, and because really when you create synthetic data, you want to recreate the data messiness to some extent, because you want to maintain fidelity. But I won't say that all the types of messiness can be accommodated, but I think a lot of them can at this point. The technology the methods have improved quite a bit over the last few years. So I don't see that as a huge challenge.
Thanks a lot. So the next question that we have in the chat would be, you've talked a lot about the synthesization of structured clinical data, and what do you think, or what is your experience? Could these techniques or related techniques also be applied to protect, for example, medical images, radiology images, or even genomic data?
Well, there's a large body of work on the generation of synthetic images with respect to in the health domain. There's also a body of work on that. I mean, the more traditional ways of evaluating images has been membership disclosure, but from a privacy perspective. The identity disclosure, I haven't seen much there in terms of identity disclosure on images. But there is work on evaluating privacy risk for images and methods to create them. That's also growing and very active. We don't do that ourselves in terms of our research group and commercialization activity. We're focused on structured data, but there's certainly a body of work there. With respect to genomic data, there's very formative work in that space. It's a very challenging problem just because of the complexity, you know, of the sequences that need to be generated. And there, you know, any small errors or distortions can be material. So I think there's work happening in this space, and I would say it's at the formative stage, and I think that will take quite a few years to mature and produce results. But certainly some activity there as well. But it's not ready for real applications. I think that's really a research topic.
Okay, thanks. So I would say we do two more questions. One question that we also had in the chat is referring to recent work from Camila Troncoso at EPFL, claiming that synthetic data does not really offer a better trade-off between privacy protection and data utility than traditional anonymization techniques. Are you aware of this work, and what is your perspective on this?
Yeah, I'm aware of that work. I think I have a different interpretation of the results of her work. One of the approaches that were used in that body of work is to look at attribute disclosure itself as being a problem, but I would argue that attribute disclosure has to be conditional on identity disclosure. So attribute disclosure is when you are able to draw inferences from data, and there is a school of thought that if you're able to draw inferences from data, that's a privacy violation. There's another school of thought, which I fall into, is that drawing inferences from data is statistics, and statistics is not a privacy violation, because if you make it a privacy violation, then you're essentially banning statistical inference from data. It's really how you use the models and how you apply the decisions for what kind of decisions you make from the models that are built from the data. That's a problem. That's an ethical question. The privacy question is attribute disclosure, conditional on identity disclosure, and I think that's not what that body of work has done. They only looked at attribute disclosure. And then I have other technical questions about that body of work, which make me conclude that the concerns raised are not as severe as the paper makes them out to be. So to conclude, I have a different opinion on this topic. I don't think the mirage that's claimed in that body of work is really it's not as strong, right? I think we can challenge some of those conclusions. We haven't done yet. Maybe eventually get to do kind of a back and forth with the authors and so on, but we haven't done that. But I don't think that the conclusions are at face value, they can be challenged.
Okay, thanks. So final question would be a little bit on another topic. You touched on virtual patients, and one of the questions we received asked that there is often, let's say, a relatively low statistical degree of knowledge in people analyzing data or adhering to standards of statistical reporting. And so do you see any risks in using virtual patients, in particular when it comes to the interpretation of findings?
Yes, I mean, I think that there has to be some education around using data from virtual patients for sure, and the techniques you would use may have to be adjusted as well, depending on what kind of analysis you're doing. So, but I think with education and developing some well-documented methodologies, you can manage that risk. I mean, the risk of bad analysis always exists with anything we're doing when we're working with data. So we need to have appropriate training and methodologies and so on. And I think then these types of risks can be mitigated. One risk that has been raised is, will people start treating synthetic data as if it's real data? I mean, if synthetic data has very good properties and very good fidelity, then drawing conclusions from synthetic data is not necessarily a bad thing. Like I said, if you have the evidence to show that it has high fidelity. So I think that these are kinds of issues that can be managed. I don't see that as an insurmountable obstacle over time. Like we've managed, risks of poor analysis before, and I think we can manage that moving forward with analysis of synthetic data and data based on virtual patients as well.
Thanks. So with this question, I would say we conclude today's lecture. So thank you very much again, Dr. El Emam. Also, thank you very much to the audience for attending today's lecture, and have a nice rest of the day. Goodbye.
Great. Thank you.